Well, hello there. So I sent a note out today saying, my goodness, I recorded the meeting, and when I went to make the Zoom meeting for today's class available, it was nothing but an hour and some odd of blank space. So I'm going to do this tonight. Again, talking a little bit about what I remember we talked about in class today, so that you have something to refer to in your notes or to think about that might be a little bit clearer. Okay, so to recap a little bit of Wednesday's lecture, this material is over the first chapter. And one of the fundamental distinctions in the chapter is that we talk about research producers and research consumers. And to be a little autobiographical, before I got into this academic job, I was in business. And they were also research producers. The work that I did at that point was work for agencies that did youth work. The 4-H, the Southern Baptist Sunday School Board, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the National Catholic Education Association, at that time the Lutheran Church in America, it's been renamed since then, and the United Methodist Church. And they were all trying to find out how can we better support youth in our various examples. And we did many of the types of studies that are talked about here. While I'm at it, I guess I should confess also that at the time, this was back in the 1980s, we also latched on to a project looking at substance abuse with young people called the Chemical People, and none other than Nancy Reagan was the person who was involved with some of the funding on that. I also was involved in some work in the religious beliefs of members of the United States Congress. So there's industry research out there, and I think we don't do a good enough job of talking about all those things. Marketing research in businesses, hospitals that decide, should we build a hospital here or should we build a hospital there? All do the kinds of research that you're going to learn about in psychology. And it's out there, pays a lot better than academia, and it's sometimes translational, sometimes even basic work. If you want to do basic work and you're kind of interested in, heaven forbid, statistics or personnel, the military also does an awful lot of basic work. The Navy, for example, funds a lot of work in my area of quantitative psychology. Research consumers, we are all research consumers. And as you get to be an old man like me, health becomes an issue. I'm in excellent health at the moment, but you do find yourself talking with doctors and asking them, on what do you base your point of view? And why are we doing this particular test? Some of you will become parents, or maybe you're parents already. And when you talk with teachers and the best way to educate your children, or when you take your kids to events, or when you take your kids to the doctor, you also need to be an active consumer of research. Should I vaccinate my kid? Is this type of a school the best for my child? And as the events of the past few weeks have shown, thinking about research, thinking about what is true, thinking about what is research is an active part of a functioning democracy. How do we evaluate our politicians? Some of you will actually go out and be politicians. Kavanaugh Noss, for example, was a former student I worked with. I think he's still around here in Columbia. And they use data to make policy decisions. I remember a person when I was a postdoc at Penn State who was in psychology, and she said, I'm a clinical person. I really can't get into all the statistics stuff. Can you help me? And I tutored her and helped with the dissertation and so forth. And at the end, she came back and said, you know what? I started my practice, and we have to get contracts from the county, from the state, and they want data. They want to know that the money they're spending is being spent well. And a lot of the statistics, things that she learned and research techniques came into play in convincing people to give your clinic more money. We've talked a little bit about why the producer role is important. I mean, we need to know information, and why the consumer role is important. And the chapter also talks about the benefits of being a good consumer, and I've just gotten done highlighting a few of those. Other producer roles, well, yeah, a few of you are going to go on to take more coursework in psychology. Research methods number 2 is the next on your docket, and I'm hoping that some of the things will play into what you'll be picking up in that course. And as I mentioned before, I have a few ideas about how to make the way a little smoother for you in your next class. A few of you are going to go on to graduate school, medical school, things like that. Your research skills here, I mean, get all you can for those types of environments. Doing research is a good thing to have on your Vita these days. Some of you at Mizzou can participate in research and working in a research lab. There are industries and businesses, even here in Columbia, there's lab work to be done that you can get involved with. And as I mentioned before, you can also be a producer by doing government work. One of the things that we're doing this past week has been to work with the Kansas legislature on their proposals for women's health, for example. Consumer roles you got right now, as I mentioned, psychology classes, or when you read what's in the news or think about how to interpret what you're seeing in the media or the internet. For your future career, you can also be a consumer. You're going to have to evaluate recommendations you get. And as I mentioned, for your future life as a citizen, a parent, or a patient. What are some of the things you get by being a critical consumer of information? Well, I think one of the most important things is a critical attitude and a way of suspending judgment, of saying, well, my gut tells me one thing, and I've read this information on the internet, and my friends or experts I really value say things. Could there be something wrong with that? And one of the things about research methods in this class is kind of a fun, almost a lawyerly game of, well, you make this argument, but have you thought about? And it's that habit of not accepting things, suspending some judgment, and then saying, well, in light of what I know, here's what I think. That is kind of a goal of what I have for this class. In a nutshell, the elevator talk version of this class is we want to talk about how psychology is a science, and there's an awful lot of terms going on. Yes, I have the paper copy here. You can also look at the electronic ones. At the end of every chapter, there's a thing of key terms. A lot of what this class is what are these terms? Can I say in words that are plain and understandable to me, or pretend you're explaining it to your grandparents? What do these things mean? And then talk about the connections between these terms. We're going to use these terms also to help you understand the reasoning behind a study and how we interpret that study. But before we get started, what is this thing called science? You know, I think one of the things that you come away when you read this chapter is you have that feeling that, oh yeah, psychology is a science too. Yes, we're a science just like everything else. But what do we mean by the word science? And who is a scientist? And I would appeal to your own experience. So let's take a look at some classes at MU. Here's a chemistry class. And I really, really liked the fact that you folks were willing to talk in class. So I'm going to kind of summarize what things we had. Well, if you're in a chemistry class, the thing over here on the wall is that periodic table in the upper right-hand corner. These are the facts in chemistry. And in Minnesota, they're baked into ceramic tiles on the wall. Knowledge in this class is literally baked in stone, and it's not going to change probably. And the second thing you notice in the middle, kind of down 2/3 of the way, there's this bakelite topped table. It's got a sink in it, and it's got little things for gas, for oxygen, and I believe natural gas for doing experiments. There's kind of this image that if you're in chemistry lab, there might be things going on. And one of our members said, yeah, actually, I took a class where this was used. I took several classes up to organic chemistry too. Never saw that thing ever used. It was just a very expensive stage prop. Take a look at other things about this. There's one instructor at the front of the class giving the information out here on the overhead. There also kind of looks like there's a couple of laptops there. Everybody is studiously writing things down and watching this information be conveyed to them. What does it tell you about What makes you think it's a science? Well, we have all of these things out here. This is our discipline. And the facts in chemistry are being transmitted to you. You get to write them down. You get to know what they are. Here's a biology class. It's a little different. First of all, nobody's sitting in rows and watching the sage on the stage. You're seeing the instructor. In this particular class, he appears to be writing a few things on the whiteboard. People are writing things down. The class is arranged in tables. This is so you can do labs. And those little drawers on the side of the classroom, well, those are for the specimens or the other apparatus. At some point in some classes, like when I took comparative anatomy, you're going to pull those things open and drag out your formaldehyde-covered shark and dissect the thing. And the instructor will walk from table to table and talk about your technique and point out the structures to you. The students sit around that table. So in biology, there's a process, there's a thing you do in biology that is part of mastering that particular discipline. This particular day, they seem to be writing a lot of stuff down. And here's English class. Not to be true, it looks like Knights of the Round Table. Everything is circular. What's being communicated here? Well, it looks like the instructor's making a point here. Everybody has brought their books along. It looks like people are bringing papers to class. There's not notebooks there. They wrote some things down, didn't they? You're advancing your interpretation. Are some interpretations better than others? I believe I shared a story of, kind of my first experiences in a college classroom, where the instructor said, Mr. Wood, I would like you to give your interpretation of this piece. And I stood up and said, well, I didn't like it. And he said, well, I'm not interested in whether you liked it or not. I want to know your interpretation. And I remember being so confused at that time, because for me, at that point in my life, my interpretation was whether I liked it or not. In English, I hope, if you're taking a good English class, some interpretations are judged better than other interpretations. You have to make an argument. But is English a science just because there are arguments going on? And finally, we get to a psychology classroom. Well, actually, I cheated. I couldn't find any images of a Mizzou psychology classroom, so this is from Columbia College. Here we have the class arranged in a circle, and the instructor stands in the middle to guide the discussion. It looks like she made this on her own initiative. She had the students move the things around in a circle, because you can see there's some empty chairs in the middle. They're still in the rows. So you can stand in front and get all this wisdom from the instructor. No, everything's arranged in a circle. People's notebooks are open. They're talking. We're guiding a discussion. We're trying to figure out what is going on. What are the points of our lecture? And it seems also, like the English class, that your opinions are being solicited in this discussion, in addition to getting those facts. Here's another psych class, bigger one. Myself, I don't like bigger classes. That's kind of one of the advantages. I went to a small four-year liberal arts college, and there's a knowledge college in Mizzou that has the same thing. You get smaller classes. You work harder in them. But notice a few things about this. There are name tags in front of everything. This instructor wants to know the person's names so that she can have a conversation with them. It looks as though she's making a point of interpretation. The students are looking at her. Some of them are writing things down. Some of them are listening to what she has to say. I would think that hopefully there are some questions, some dialogue going on in this classroom. Kind of looks like in her right hand, she's got the Donald J. Trump Memorial Sharpie. So probably she was writing a few things on the board to introduce the topics to get the material in. But the messages here are that in the psychology class, the information is kind of a two-way street. I'm not just delivering it to you like a chemistry class, and I'm not trying to teach you a technique like in a biology class. So what kind of a science is psychology? especially when we're talking about things like brain science on the one hand, social psychology, God forbid, quantitative psychology that I work on the other hand. Is it something where you memorize hard facts? Probably not. Is it something you do? Probably, maybe sometimes. You know, one of the problems I think in quantitative in my area, people say, well, I'm going to learn how to do something in statistics. Oh, here's my script. I press the run button. Here it is. And that really is not what thinking quantitatively means. Is it a kind of argument? You betcha. Psychology is about making an argument. It's a particular type of argument, though. This leads us to the question, you know, will we ever know for sure in psychology? If so, how would we ever know for sure? And if not, why would you study psychology in the first place? Let's talk a little about who's a scientist anyway. Is Benjamin Franklin a scientist? Wow, would he say that he was a scientist? Well, he worked with the French Academy of Science. He did a lot of work in electricity, static electricity, and as we're seeing here, thunderstorms. He also could be argued to be a psychologist in that he investigated and exposed the idea of animal magnetism of Dr. Mesmer. So, gee, could this person have described themselves as being a scientist? What about Galileo Galilei, father of observational astronomy? Well, yes, Galileo had data. Galileo argued for a theory. Maybe it's also worthwhile to mention that, you know, we often have this view that science enters stage left and superstition and ignorance exit stage right, and science is a victory. Well, at some point later on, I'd like to tell you a little about Galileo. He stole his data. We even stole technology for the telescope and tried to convince the Doge of Venice to fund him to build more telescopes with his stolen plans and stolen data. It might surprise you to know that Galileo and the Pope were drinking buddies before the Pope was called to be a Pope, when he was just named Sylvester. And actually, the data that both the Pope and Galileo had were not the best explanation for the data at the time. Actually, the data would have argued more strongly for the Earth being the center at that time. And here's old Edward Jenner. Gosh knows we like vaccines. This person observed some data. Did Jenner have a really good theory? Not so much. But as one of our number explained, Jenner observed that milkmaids came in contact with cows, and contracted something called cowpox. And those individuals who had suffered from that seemed to be immune from smallpox. Now, smallpox was a terrible disease. It was horribly disfiguring. As a matter of fact, you were thought to be so ugly after contracting smallpox. It was a major reason for people took holy orders, that they went into monasteries and nunneries, was to be away from people because they just couldn't bear the sight of how disfigured people were. Did he have a theory? Well, no, he kind of went out to a cow and got a pustule and made an incision in his son's arm. No human subjects involved here, please. And deliberately infected his son. And that son did not contract smallpox. And this was the argument for a vaccine. But was Edward Jenner a scientist? Well, now kind of, and here's our last one, Sir Isaac Newton. Never got married, discoverer of the composition of light. The prism is in his right hand. He's looking at how light comes in and how it gets bent to differential possibilities by the quartz prism that he holds in his hand. This was a theory in competition with another theory of the day by Johann Goethe. And the idea of mathematics to use to explain phenomenon. Some people would say Newton was a mathematician, and he was kind of co-discoverer with Leibniz of calculus. But he also applied these mathematical ideas to understand things about the world around. So now for the big reveal. Would any of these people have called themselves a scientist? And we can say with certainty, the answer is no. This is because we know very precisely the exact year that the word scientist was invented. So if you like to play around, you kind of Google n-gram. N-gram is kind of a fun thing because you can enter a word into it. It will show you over the course of years for a variety of libraries how frequently a given word gets mentioned. And you'll find, if you do so, that the word scientist starts to appear for the first time in 1833. Kind of fun to look at this little chart here, you know, gee, science gets mentioned a lot, and it keeps on getting a lot until 1960, you know, sort of the Sputnik years, the after World War II aftermath, the dedication to science, and it kind of falls off in those years afterwards as the disciplines within science become more popular and people refer to themselves less as scientists and more as biologists, chemists, neuroscientists. 1833, well, what's so special about that? We know who invented the word scientist. William Whewell, attractive young man in this picture. I mean, there are other pictures of him as an old person like me, but it's a lot more pleasant, visually pleasing to look at him when he was younger. He was an English polymath, a scientist, also an Anglican priest, a philosopher, very much into history of science. And in that age, the early 1800s, you could be a polymath. You could work in a lot of different areas, physics, geology, astronomy. By all means, get out there and use your, what my daughter refers to, millennial magic, and Google William Whewell, because he's kind of a fun person to look at. He also did some crowd-funded science on tides. He got lots of people together to gather the data and start understanding better how the tides behave. Important for an island nation like Britain, and also a nation like Britain, which was seeking to rule the waves, the interests of empire. And yes, he invented the word scientist. The funny thing is, it was almost a joke. He said, well, if we want to think about an artist doing art, maybe a scientist does science. And it was kind of a joke. The term of usage before that was the phrase natural philosopher, rather than a theoretical philosopher or more general philosopher. A natural philosopher was someone who tried to use the techniques of philosophy to understand the world around him. Whewell didn't necessarily like the word scientist. The other words that were in the running that he kind of liked was nature poker or nature peeper, which to our eyes are a little funnier, but now, you know, maybe would have calculated a little bit more humility in this whole science enterprise. Scientist was not popular because, being an ist word, it was similar to other words like atheist or economist, you know, or maybe even journalist, although that hadn't been invented yet. But, you know, occupations far removed from the throne of grace. The funny thing is the word scientist caught on in the US and it kind of died out in England. And as it became more popular, many people in England started to think of it as something that it was so ugly, the Americans must have invented it. It's a cheap and vulgar product of transatlantic slang, or an American barbarous trisyllable. And the journal Science, which is kind of up there with Nature, did not editorially use the word scientist until 1920. I wrote a chapter in a book on nonlinear dynamics, which sort of talks about this story. It's a fun one. What was William Whewell talking about? Well, it was a book by a woman named Mary Somerville. She wrote a book called On the Connection of the Sciences, which in the spirit of the early 1800s showed how inquiry in a lot of areas, astronomy, physics, chemistry, geography, meteorology, all had some common threads. And that some principles, like gravity, were present in things like the raindrop in the falls of the Niagara, the weight of air, and the periods of the moon. And she talked about a lot of different phenomena from the perspective of both science and math. She was an exceptional woman. She taught herself algebra. Her parents did not like all this mathematizing that went on. And she corresponded with a lot of the scientists of her day, and was fluent also in French. Mary Somerville's book On the Connection was the most published book in English until the advent of Darwin's Origin of Species. Now, you might think the 1830s, barbaric time for women. Obviously, no one took Mary Somerville seriously. That's not true. William Whewell wrote a wonderfully laudable review of Mary Somerville and her achievements. The only thing, of course, being British, sniff, sniffs, the regrettable thing about Mary Somerville was not that she was a woman, but that she was Scottish. But we'll overlook that because her contributions are so exceptional. So what is science? What is not science? Notice I'm not saying what is scientific and what is unscientific, or what is right and what is wrong, because even Galileo is an example of maybe a wrong theory that was right in spite of itself. It's rather, we want to know, how can we distinguish what is science from what is non-science? What's science versus pseudoscience, or even other products of human activity like art and literature and beliefs? Now, on Facebook, I run the Critical Rationalism user group, about 6,000 people on it, and a lot of discussion there is about a philosopher named Karl Rainer Popper, who also wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, which figures a lot in the liberation movements of several countries like Václav Havel and Czechoslovakia. And I'll talk with you later about how my life intersects with that person. But Karl Popper was a philosopher who came up with a radically new idea of science against the background of what people at the time thought science was. Well, what is this? I guess you could summarize at that time, way back in the 1920s, the view of science is characterized by the words logical positivism. The logical positivists thought that it would be possible to build a science based on scientific statements, and we could build more and more and accumulate more and more scientific facts. And as a result, because each of these could be verified, that we would build grand scientific models as a result. To be factually significant, I have to be able to verify a fact. To be able to verify a fact, I have to be able to observe it, or I have to be able to induce it from derived experience. Now, I don't need to go down that rabbit hole for a minute, but the idea is that these logical positivists thought that things in science are subject to a verifiability criterion. Well, even today in psychology, in other sciences, you will hear people say, I'm a logical positivist. And by that, they mean that anything that is science has to be something that's observed, and that we will build science on the basis of observables. And it is against this idea of what science is, but quite frankly, this little book seems to dip a toe in every now and then I don't really care for, that Karl Popper was answering. The book talks about falsifiability. In order to demark science from non-science, it has to be falsifiable. Well, so I didn't get a chance to talk about this in class, but what were some of the things that Karl Popper found as non-falsifiable? One grand theory coming out of Austria was communism, Karl Marx. Karl Popper was in fact a communist for a bit of his life. And if you think about Marxian theory, the prediction of Marx's ideas was that the revolution was going to begin in Germany. Why? Because Germany was industrialized, they had a lot of workers, the population was very educated. And when all of a sudden the revolution occurred in Russia with Lenin, oh, well, Marxism isn't wrong. We didn't take into account that Lenin was a singularly charismatic individual. So Marxism is still right, but we didn't anticipate that Lenin would be right. The second unfalsifiable theory was Sigmund Freud and some of his acolytes, because you can't falsify at that time anything that Freud said. If you agree with Freud, that's fine, you're enlightened. If you disagree with Freud, well, that's because you are repressed, or that's because you don't quite understand the theory properly. Popper's idea is that statements, or systems of statements, in order to get counted as scientific, have to be capable of conflicting with possible or conceivable observations. Science contrasts with scientism. Scientism is this excessive belief in the power of scientific method. I did an interview many years ago with a graduate student at Mizzou in psychology. And I said, do you think we'll ever know for sure if emotions live in a certain part of the brain? And she said, oh yeah, we will. Science is a rocket. We're going to know for sure someday. Other parts of scientism is that science will tell us what is ethical or moral. I don't think that's true. That science will give us a correct answer. No. As we talk about at other points in this book, and as Karl Popper talks about, we're going to hold a theory currently as our best theory, or maybe least worst, but we will not know for sure. Another characteristic of scientism is that science, or even one discipline, like chemistry, like clinical psychology, is the only way to know things. Science is but one way of knowing many things. Although science is an attempt to know something, scientific conclusions are not certain, they're not universal, they are not necessary, that is, they don't logically must needs flow from other things I know, and they are not timeless. They are often conditional, based on a few things, based on some side conditions. In the case of statistics, based on the assumptions of your statistical model. They are uncertain. We do not know them for sure. They are a set of observations that might be right, might be wrong. They may be particular. The book makes a great point of talking about, what we know of the human mind based on the study of introductory psychology students is perhaps not representative. When you're looking at information from producers and consumers of scientists, think about whether this is scientism. And some of the key words that you hear are, we now know, science says, this conclusion is based on a lot of data, so it must be right. Or I pre-registered my study, and here's my statistical model, so therefore we know. My study showed that, boom, without any discussion of what the limitations are. To return to the themes of the book, scientists are empiricists. We deal with data. We work in a community. We tackle applied and basic problems. Where do problems come from? What makes a problem? We'll talk about that later. Scientists don't live in an ivory tower. We make our work public. And we talk to the world, either other scientists via a journal, or maybe people who are really interested in the scientific details, or to journalism more broadly, society. Well, what is empiricism? As I said before, it deals with data, but it's important to guys think about, I'm old. Let's look at the historical process here. Psychology didn't start out being empiricist. It started out, the first psychologists like Wundt, Titchener, Boring, used introspection, that by sitting in a chair and thinking about how you think, you could arrive at a theory. The problem with just introspecting and think about, well, how do I remember things, is that you can't test things based on data. Now, this doesn't mean that introspection is entirely gone from psychology. You've filled out self-report surveys, you've done interviews, Some of you have been asked to think aloud as you solve a problem. All of those are getting a report of an introspection from someone. The difference being that this data is somebody else's introspection, and I'm using it in order to test hypotheses. So here's Harlow's study of monkeys. And Harlow's study is kind of nice in that there was one of two alternatives for the monkey to choose. And in Harlow's case, the animals uniformly chose the physically comforting environment rather than just the food environment. And there are lots of big pictures of Harlow's monkeys still clinging to the soft terry cloth monkey and then going over to get food from the wire monkey mother. This was a test. And this is the diagram presented in the book. And it's okay as far as it goes. I'm going to expand it a little bit using actually some ideas from William Whewell. That we start with a theory at the top, and this theory leads us to pose research questions. And the research questions give us a research design. And after we have that research design and collect our data, we pre-register it before we do the analysis, and we then examine our data. The data are either going to not support things or they will support our theory. If they support our theory, we ride the left-hand circle up and we say, oh, gee, we have a little more confidence in this theory. Have some side issues on that to talk about later. What if the data don't support it? Well, maybe we did something wrong in our research design. Maybe we didn't operationalize our variables. Maybe we don't have the right measuring instruments. Maybe this is going to lead us to revise the theory. I would also add, maybe this causes us to throw a theory away. Now, this cycle is an important part of it. The cycle probably doesn't work exactly the way that it's printed here, and we'll have a few more things to talk about there as we go through this particular PowerPoint. Some things to remember from the book. We don't prove a theory. We never cross a finish line. There is not what lawyers would call a clear, bright line between truth and false here. Good theories are falsifiable. I can't say my theory accounts for that. And to some extent, sometimes in a theory, we make a little side condition, or we make it a little more elaborate to take into account these things. In developmental psychology, for example, Piaget had an idea of how children progress through cognitive stages. More and more ancillary ideas like decollage, we started to make the theory more complicated to account for the data, happened over the course of time. To some people, that means Piagetian theory is more wonderful and elaborate and comprehensive. To other people, this has what they call, the feeling of baling wire and chewing gum. We're adding more things onto our theory so we don't have to abandon the theory. A theory is never truth. A theory is not true. And actually, a good theory is not a complete accounting. It's an oversimplification of what you're looking at. This is a little quote from Karl Popper. A theory isn't true. The method of science depends on our attempts to describe the world with simple theories. Theories that are complex become untestable, even if they look like they're true. Science is the art of systematic oversimplification, the art of discerning what we may with advantage omit. So for example, in the Harlow study, we kind of made the assumption that one monkey is kind of like the other monkey in order to do our analysis. Or if you look later on in the book, they talk about, is going out and expressing your anger good for you? Does it reduce the amount of tension you have, or is it actually harmful? Well, if you go over to, say, the gym in the before times, you might see a bunch of young men predominantly playing basketball and working off their energy so they can settle down later and study. Those are certain types of people I probably am not one to go up and do that. Well, is my theory a universal theory, as described in the book here? Or maybe are there different types of people for whom different laws apply? And here's the last thing I wanted to stop on, because it's kind of where we left this lecture off, is this theory data cycle isn't quite as simple as just saying I sit in my little black armchair here and hatch out a theory. When I make my theory and when I do my observations, the observations are already laden with the theory I had. Now, you are all young people and you have recently invented sex, so sexual topics are front of mind. So this is my example. When the microscope was invented and people first looked at human sperm under the microscope, this is what they saw. There's a little bitty person inside there, all curled up in the fetal position, actually. And if we kind of draw that out a little bit more, it looks like there's a little person inside, a skinny person and a less skinny person. Were these scientists making things up? No, they actually truly thought they saw this. This is because they had a theory called formalism, kind of an idea that goes back to Aristotle, actually, that the male principle has the forms and the female principle is a receptive form, a receptive medium in which that form can unfold. The observation was informed by the beliefs that the person had. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about that particular theory. Okay? I'm going to stop the lecture here because this is where we're going to pick the next one up.